Hello there, and welcome to Community Policy Speaks, our podcast here at the Community Policy Forum. Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities impacting Muslim communities here in the UK. We're joined by two brilliant guests in today's episode of our podcast. Firstly, Professor Tahir Abbas, who is Professor of Radicalization Studies at Leiden University's Institute of Security and Global Affairs in The Hague. He graduated with a PhD in Ethnic Relations from the University of Warwick in 2001. His current research interests include Islamophobia and radicalization, gender and violence, and polarization and extremism. He is the author, editor, and co-editor of 20 books, as well as the author, editor, and co-editor of over 100 peer-reviewed articles and chapters. Secondly, we're joined by our very own Samiha Rafiq. Samiha is a graduate in both Islamic studies and psychological sciences and works as a researcher at the Community Policy Forum to put her interests in politics, policy, and community organization to good use. Professor Abbas and Samiha, thank you so much for taking time out to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
Having
Thank you.
me.
So let's launch straight into today's discussion. So firstly, I wanted to come to yourself, Professor Abbas, and ask you, well, what are the far right strategies in framing Muslim communities as societal threats? Particularly, we've seen the grooming gang narrative resurface in recent weeks. So with a focus on that, how would you say the far right narrative around Muslim communities in the UK has evolved in recent years?
So essentially, what the far right do, and this is a big spectrum in terms of extreme right and radical right, they cherry pick. They cherry pick various high-profile cases that have related to South Asian Muslim men and place all the energy, all the focus on those groups. And what they do also is to present it as a group-based issue, taking it away from individual dynamics, which are important in trying to get a deeper understanding. So this is part of their strategy. It's selectively cherry picking and then projecting it, magnifying it through the instruments that they are able to mobilize, which in this case is the use of social media in particular and social media influencers, including various political actors who sort of jump on the bandwagon for opportunistic reasons. So it's cherry picking, it's magnifying and disproportionately emphasizing and then playing on existing stereotypes and narratives of othering relating to Muslims, which are sadly well established right now.
Thank you, Professor Abbas. Your answer leans perfectly well onto my first question for Samiha, which is around social media. So, Samiha, I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, how has the spread of misinformation and disinformation on social media influenced public perceptions and policy discussions about the issue of CSE and grooming gangs, so CSE being child sexual exploitation?
I think misinformation on social media really has a huge impact on how people view child sexual exploitation, and especially when it comes to who is responsible. And as we mentioned, there's like the focus on grooming gangs, and social media posts and far-right groups push this idea that it's primarily committed by Muslim men. And what you find on social media is usually reinforced by misinformation that's spread or it's in the public domain. So I think there was a Quilliam Foundation report that claimed 80%, 84% of CSE offenders were Asian men. And this obviously was later debunked, but it's already taken root in public discourse. And that kind of information is then, it's fed into social media. And so then public discourse and public opinion zero in on specific communities, and it creates that sense of other. And it doesn't matter that, for example, the Home Office has itself stated in a 2020 report that it's the most CSE offenders are white men, but you wouldn't know that from headlines or online conversations. And this has immense real world consequences. So you've got, prevent strategy often targets Muslim communities under the guise of like safeguarding. And that means Muslim communities feel really scrutinized. And so social media really just amplifies this fear, this mistrust. It's kind of like it's almost, moral panic around such issues. And because of that disinformation, no matter how much you counter it, it doesn't do a lot because it's already taken root.
Thank you, Samiha. I think you mentioned some really powerful points there, particularly the data around CSE and the way in which we can use that data as members of think tanks, as academics, the way in which we can use that data to debunk this far-right sensationalist narrative around grooming gangs. So I wanted to stay with yourself, Samiha, and staying with the issue of social media and ask you, what role do algorithms play in echo chambers and the spread of far-right ideologies, particularly with the role that Elon Musk has played in amplifying this narrative in the last month? Maybe we'll come on to him a little bit more in a second, but since he has acquired ownership of Twitter, now X, what role do you think algorithms play in perpetuating misinformation and disinformation in online spaces?
So I think algorithms are really about they help to form echo chambers. So platforms like YouTube, X, Instagram, Facebook, they're designed to keep you engaged, and so they want to show you the most sensationalized or the content that an individual interacts with on a regular basis. So like if you watch a video about immigration concerns, you are going to see more of that. You're going to keep seeing more videos about it, and eventually it will take you to far-right content. And I think that's kind of like where the phrase falling down a rabbit hole comes from. And so far-right groups are really great. They have a good understanding of how algorithms work. And so they utilize it again to exploit these systems, and it gives you content that's emotionally charged. So fear, anger, outrage, because those feelings make people click, share, and comment. And the other way that algorithms really reinforce or create these echo chambers is that they are also designed to block out certain voices. They're designed to block out certain stances. And I think that during during the time period of the war in Gaza, um, there was suggestions that algorithms are Islamophobic because they reinforce these ideas about the notion of like Palestinian activism being essentially a crime, and enhancing far-right voices surrounding the protests, but effectively blocking out counter narratives. And so that is also something that's really key here when you're trying to understand CSE, the grooming gangs, the far right. They also block out counter narratives. And so people have to work harder to create counter echo chambers, if that makes sense, or to de-influence, I guess. And that's really what's happening right now as well. With Musk, you see, it's a flurry, like what happened at the inauguration is being picked up and it's everywhere. And you see it once and it keeps coming back, and it's an inevitability.
Thank you so much, Samiha. Professor Abbas, I wanted to come back to yourself. So we've discussed a little bit about social media. I wanted to
Mm.
ask you about mainstream media and
Mm.
what role mainstream media outlets can play in pushing this narrative around grooming gangs and very much in validating far-right narratives around Muslims, and whether you feel these kind of narratives detract from the experiences of victims of CSE and whether these kinds of narratives actually do more harm than good for these victims.
Yeah, so mainstream media is also sadly part of the problem. We talk about social media, but mainstream media, in terms of the main news channels, the broadcast channels, there's quite a lot of groupthink around how journalists talk about these issues and project them. Obviously, TV channels are mindful of audiences and income revenues, and competing for sensationalism in a market where where there's a sort of flood in terms of a choice of news sources. So sensationalism sells, and it's always been the case with media. Media news has always been packaged. It's not actual truth in any objective sense. There may be little sort of elements of truth in terms of facts that are necessary for any report to be valid, but a lot of it is packaged. I often describe in my lectures the media is like baked beans. It comes in 57 varieties. It's still baked beans, and then I think this is the problem. And with 24 News 7. There's so much choice, so you have to compete with ever greater sensationalism to keep your audiences primed in between the ad breaks, often in a state of anxiety, waiting for the next news flash or breaking news. So yeah, mainstream media, there's a groupthink among journalists. There's obviously tight editorial control. Recently, I think there's been quite a lot of criticism leveled at the BBC around its coverage in relation to the recent conflict in the Middle East. That has highlighted that to a lot of people who perhaps may not have been aware of some of the drift that's been going on, certainly in the BBC. And alternative voices, even in mainstream television news, tend to get drowned out because they can't compete financially, but also always dismissed and easily dismissed. And so what is it? What's the payoff? The payoff is this heightened awareness, which is sensationalized, that keeps people primed in between breaks. It's a group thing among journalists who come from a very narrow substrata of society, which self-reinforces this particular group think. And then this drift is problematic because we see it in terms of wider political issues across certainly Western Europe. If we look at all the spaces across Western Europe, we see more and more of a drift to the radical right, extreme right, far right. And media and politics are like this unholy alliance. And it's taken off in even more extreme terms over the last 20, 30 years for sure. There used to be much more critical media, much more independent media, mainstream media, but it's all been drowned out by global corporate media ownership. And that's a major problem. And so people do go to podcasters and certainly YouTubers and influencers for their alternative sources. And some of that is also extreme and warped in the kind of general sense. And it's difficult to really find objective, clinically put together news items in the way that we might have perhaps had in the past. So there's been a gradual drift, and it's a worrying space for sure. And of course, what it does in reality is it takes away attention from more objective understandings of some of the problems. When we think about these issues of CSE, we're looking at real issues of inequality, structural disadvantage. These young girls who from very underprivileged, working class, broken home backgrounds who needed support and resources have been neglected all the way up to the point at which then they enter into these rather unfortunate spaces, not always by choice, of course, far from it, in fact. And the point is that, and saying that it's a lifestyle choice but among police officers is also a problem, because that reflects on poor policing, essentially. And there's been a lot of learning, there's a lot of the independent inquiries have found that there have been institutions that have been wanting here. So lots of reform is required, but it's all on the back of systematic resources that haven't really been provided. So much needs to be done at the structural level in order to bring change at the cultural level around how we talk about these things and how we engage with them at the everyday level.
I really found the point that you mentioned at the end very interesting, and that's something I wanted to come to a little bit more towards the end of the episode, where we discuss solutions to these challenges and really how we can find a constructive way forward in terms of discussing, number one, and number two, actually combating this issue of child sexual exploitation here in the UK. I wanted to stay with yourself, Professor Abbas, and I think you did touch on this in your previous answer, and that's around the role of politicians and political discourse. How do you feel that political discourse has contributed to reinforcing the grooming gang narrative? This last month, you've seen the likes of Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick, and others chime in, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. But going back a number of years, Suella Braverman, Priti Patel, these have all been very vocal voices on this issue. What role do you think that these figures have played?
A really problematic role. They're driving forward sensationalism in order to generate political capital among their electoral base. again, competing in a space where there's a restricted opportunity for differences to shine through. So they tending further and further to the right. And we've seen that happen to the Tory party quite destructively, self-destructively, ultimately. But also the Labour Party is trying to make sure it doesn't lose some aspects of its electoral base. And it's really, really problematic because it simplifies complex issues to align with the biases that sometimes exist among these politicians, but also knowing that these will drive certain voting outcomes, and behaviors that they're interested in. It's really short-termist thinking. It's really opportunistic. It's really problematic, and I think it's a reflection of the political classes we see across Western Europe, where it's really easy for them to pick on these kinds of existing prejudices that have been very much around and highlight them with a magnifying lens, project them as somehow a more systematic understanding, when in fact it's quite the opposite. And then people sadly lap it up, and then in the absence of alternative voices, they're somewhat stuck. So it's they're really, the political classes in our current climate have a lot to answer for, because they're the way they've communicated about Muslims, about this grooming gang issue in particular, has been woeful.
Thank you, Professor Abbas. I would completely agree with your point there around the role of politicians. And I wanted to come back to yourself, Samiha. So we've discussed social media, we've discussed the mainstream media, and we've discussed the role of political discourse. I wanted to raise a new series on Netflix called The Walk-In. Samiha, I believe that you've watched the series. Could you tell us a little bit about what impact the portrayal of the kinds of issues we've discussed today can have on either raising awareness or unintentionally reinforcing stereotypes?
I think that it's really important in how it gives us an idea on what far-right radicalization and hate crimes look like, and how, it's so easy for young people to become susceptible. And it really highlights how they pick on lonely individuals, how they pick on people that don't have much of a support structure. And it also highlights the kind of theories that the far right like to use in order to prey on people's vulnerabilities. And I think that it also gives us the ability to understand the risk of extremism and how it can be that, anyone could fall into it if the right person is telling you the information that you need to hear, and also the risks that you take in standing up against it. And it also betrays how dangerous social media can be, because I think the idea of misinformation, and there is a lot, it focuses a lot on misinformation, how, that there's treatment for cancer, but it's being withheld by minority groups because they don't want other people to get, well, the idea of immigration, but kind of moving away from the walk-in and just looking at the broader perspective of representation and how a narrative can be portrayed. I think it's also really important to keep in mind the fact that if not done properly, it does perpetuate stereotypes. And so, issues like grooming gangs, where it is so, in social media, in the media as well, it's very much connected to minority communities, Muslim communities, when such narratives, when they are depicted on screen, and I'm not saying The Walk-In does that, but just as a general understanding, it's really important that there's, representation, and it's really important that real issues that are systemic, like failures across policing, social services, and beyond, and the nuances of that is maintained, because it can get lost when it comes to things like dramatic portrayals, like drama. But I think The Walk-In does really give us a great insight into the mind of far-right individuals and how it works, and just this incredible danger that, people put themselves in by being a part of these groups, because the moment they decide to change, the moment that they decide they want out, there isn't a way out. So I think that was really interesting.
No, that is really interesting and definitely a series that we'd recommend that everyone listening go and watch. So coming back to yourself, Professor Abbas, when it comes to narratives that are pushed by the far right, such as narratives around Asian grooming gangs, what role can that play in the process of radicalization of individuals, but also when we look at wider society generally, we look at the far right riots of last summer. In what ways can this process actually exacerbate racism and Islamophobia and foster a climate of hostility and hatred towards minority communities such as Muslims?
Yeah, so the narrative, the story is warped to start off with, then with the content that's added by social media influencers, political actors, and also billionaires in the context of Southport, and more recently, it exacerbates the problem. And what does it play on? It plays on people's fears and insecurities that they hold and are therefore unable to find solutions for them through the political process. And there's a real deep problem of a lack of political trust and a lack of social trust that comes on the back of the political trust that's been growing for the last 25 years. The data supports this from across the European space around people are disengaged, are not participating in the way they used to, don't really believe that their politicians can provide for them. And so this is a breakdown in democracy. We talk about trying to keep democracy together, but it's fragile. And we're now talking about fascism and populism, authoritarianism in very real terms. It's not just an intellectual exercise anymore. We can just looking at the events of the inauguration a few days ago, and what cannot be unseen in terms of certain gestures that were given by people like Elon Musk in terms of what many describe as a Nazi salute. So this is all compounded. The individual who's in their locations, their localities, and feels that their futures have been compromised because of a lack of economic opportunities, the lack of what the privileges that they used to get, certainly as men, disappearing as a result of globalization and internationalization, and that was all done for really healthy and important reasons, means that these politicians can come in and sort of take their frustrations and misdirect it and misalign it and present it all as problems of immigration, Islam, criminality. And this is populism and authoritarianism. And again, it's becoming a real problem across the global north. And we have to be very sensitive to it in order to just sort of reflect and take a step back, because it's so overwhelming sometimes. But it plays fundamentally on vulnerabilities. Now, these vulnerabilities are not two extremism per se. It's the vulnerabilities in the minds of individuals who feel stuck and abandoned, and then, as mentioned earlier, fall into these sort of rabbit holes of groupthink, and it then creates polarization and division, which then can be further exploited by these very same populist instruments in politics, in media, in billionaire social media power.
Thank you, Professor Abbas. Coming back to yourself, Samiha, and I will come back to yourself, Professor Abbas, in due course. Samiha, how can allies and Muslim communities in particular work together to challenge these sorts of harmful narratives and create spaces for nuanced discussions?
I think there's a lot of potential, and I think the first place to start is ensuring that Muslim voices are heard. So when there are stories about grooming gangs or extremists dominating or extremism dominating the news, um, Muslim community leaders, academics, and activists, they have the potential to provide context that's often missing, but they don't get the opportunity. So I think that's a really, that's really the first place to start, that we create a structure, we create platforms that we can promote Muslim voices regarding these issues, and allies can help amplify them. And I think that it's really important that we hold media to accountable. So as communities, and if we are partnering with allied organizations, it's important for us to support campaigns. And I think that another way is through grassroots initiatives. So if there are communities that are impacted specifically, I think that, So for example, like Hope Not Hate have these community dialogue groups. They're a great example, and I think it's about pushing those amongst and I'm speaking from a Muslim perspective. I think it's great if we can get our own communities on board. So just within our localities. And obviously nothing changes until policies change. And the end goal is that it's that systemic change. And so Muslim communities, Muslim organizations, and allies, it's really about making sure that there are, we're pushing for stronger regulations on hate speech and misinformation. I think ever since I've been in this field, I have forever spoken about how we need to push for social media companies better regulation, but I've never actually seen it. And I think I'm gonna be keep saying this as a recommendation, and I don't know when we will see it, but it's something that we need to be doing. And for example, Leveson 2 has been scrapped, so that really needs to come back in, and I think there's a potential for some kind of accountability. And I think allies, they could really challenge things on our behalf. I think that's something that can be done. So issues like prevent, and I think education as well. It's a real long-term solution. Working with Muslim organizations, working with communities, and sort of other stakeholders, key stakeholders in this field, will really, give make way for resources for schools, workplaces, community groups, youth hubs to address these issues. And not only will this, combat harmful narratives, but it also creates spaces for deeper understanding. So I think those are some of the ways that we could really, work together in order to combat these harmful narratives that are perpetuated by media, by social media, and sometimes by government, really.
Thank you, Samiha. That was such a brilliant answer. A lot of layers to what you discussed there, a lot of very valuable recommendations when it comes to policy and when it comes to bringing about a genuine societal or cultural change among communities here in the UK in particular. So, Professor Abbas, how can we work together and unite in order to challenge the narratives around this issue, to challenge the far right? And particularly as an academic yourself, what can those within the academic space, within university spaces, within think tanks and civil society do in order to bring about positive change?
Thank you for that. And I think everything that's just been said is really valuable and important and necessary. And I think this reflects on local activism and engagement. And I think it's a basis to really reflect on what it is to be a Muslim. We have an ethical, a moral, and intellectual responsibility to do the right thing. And that's working with other Muslims, but crucially also working with those who are not Muslims. And there are plenty of anti-racist secular Jewish groups, individuals, communities, Christians. There's an interfaith space here, which is really valuable. And this is also about information, awareness, sharing, bringing people together around a common human cause, which here is about debunking myths that are creating division and polarization for all of us. This is a whole society dynamic. It's Muslims are minorities in the British context, and there's a set of roles and opportunities that fit around being a minority that can be taken forward. So I would encourage that, and I would also encourage building a self-confidence around this, which is really hard because Muslims have been battered for decades now in terms of systematic issues around Islamophobia and its particular variations. And it's really challenging, but we have to remain confident despite all of these obstacles. And in terms of what can happen in think tanks, universities, and the political space, again, there are good politicians in and amongst those who are less affected. There are think tanks that don't just spew the more extreme ideas. There are some progressive think tanks, and we should engage and work with them. And in the university space, I know in my lectures and classes, we broach all the difficult subjects. And it's difficult when sometimes there is an edge of conservatism in institutions, and you have to sort of work through the cracks without sort of getting yourself in trouble. I mean, I say this in all honesty, because a lot of academics feel that they're challenged by what they seemingly represent, which is, for some, to talk about racism and discrimination is seen as an existential crisis, and that's just the nature of certainly some parts of Europe for sure. Although in the UK it's much more fluid and there's much more depth for sure. So we all have our roles, we all have our responsibilities wherever we are in the spectrums of society, and we must do the best we can. Importantly, reaching out to those who are outside of our immediate faith identities, because they too are likely to possess similar kinds of concerns, fears, and hopes. And so together we can build solutions. And that's the only way forward, I think.
Thank you, Professor Abbas. I think that's a very appropriate way with which to end this discussion when it comes to looking forward in terms of creating these spaces for counter narratives, for unity, for allyship, among those of us from various faith backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and professional backgrounds as well. So I'd particularly like to thank yourself for taking time out of your schedule to join us for today's discussion. I do know that you wrote a brilliant article recently for the LSE on this issue. So I would really encourage everyone that is listening to go and check that out, and to also follow Professor Abbas on social media, because you do share some very interesting views and share important content as well on these sorts of issues. And please do also follow Community Policy Forum on Twitter, or should I say X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and on YouTube as well, where you'll be listening to this podcast episode. Do share our podcast far and wide, and do stay tuned for future episodes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.